All right, I will say good morning. We have an incredibly exciting daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Iyar. Yona Shushie Ehrenfeld for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month. L'zecha nishmas Yona's grandfather Yosef ben Shmuel Aron and Marc Karstaedt in memory of his mother Chana Bat Shraggai. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. We thank our week of learning sponsors, the Kiwi family, in honor of all the men who attended the Shiva Minyanim for Mr. Kiwi Zichron Livracha, Ari and Shoshana Lerner, in honor of the Bas Mitzvah of Yosef Chaim. Sorry. What did I say? I'm sorry. In honor of the Bar Mitzvah of Yosef Chaim being celebrated in Yirtzeh Hashem B'Shah Tov Mitzlachos this coming Shabbos, and the Shul in commemoration of the Yahrzeit of Rabbi Gevantman, Rav Chaim Friedel ben Rabbi Yitzchak Dov. We thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Rabbi Aaron and Janice Schwartzbaum, in commemoration of the Yahrzeit of Janice's mother, Thega Bas Shmuel, Chaim and Rachel Rabenstein, in commemoration of the Yahrzeit of Chaim's grandmother, Franklin Bas Yaakov Zichron Livracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And with that, let us begin. So let's start again from the Mishnah on Yud Ches Amud Aleph. We've read the first couple of lines, but let's begin again. Again, the good news is we're not finished with the Beis Hamikdash yet. There's more to do in Yirtzeh Hashem in the Beis Hamikdash, but we're transitioning back a little bit to the Kohen Gadol. So says the Mishnah, Masru lo zekenim miziknei bezdin. So remember again, as part of his education process during the 7 days of sequestering, here he's given Zikinim, some of the elders from Beis Din. So also we're going to see as we go on in this discussion that there's almost like two parts to the Kohen Gadol's education. The Kohen Gadol is sometimes educated by other Kohanim, and sometimes he's educated by members of the Sanhedrin. There's this interesting split in the teachers he has over that day. So Masrul Zikinim Ziknei Beis Din. So they went ahead and they gave over to him some of the elders of the Beis Din. And what would they do? The Koran Lefan of the Seder Hayom. They would go ahead and teach him regarding the Seder Hayom. Literally, again, the Seder, the sacrificial order of Yom Kippur. So what would they go through with him? Essentially, Parshas Achremos. So they would go through with him the entirety of Parshas Achremos and just go through the Avodah. Omrim lo, Ishi Kohen Gadol. They would say to him, Kohen Gadol, Kara ata b'ficha. We want you to read the Psukim. Shema shachachto, Shema lo lamarata. Maybe you forgot Parshas Achremos, or maybe you never learned Parshas Achremos. We'll say this is actually very profound. Just from a learning perspective, the idea that they made the Kohen Gadol actually recite the Psukim, because we know from a retention level, when you speak something out, that's for most of us. That's how when you scan something with your eyes, your ability to retain is much less than when you actively speak something out. That's why even when learning, right, there's a concept that when learning, one should go ahead and learn out loud. Dvarim she'ata motzei b'ficha nichnasim lelibecha. Right? Sometimes the things that you articulate with your lips are the very things which enter into your heart. So they don't just tell, here, Kohen Gadol, here's a Parshas Vayikra, a Chumash Vayikra, read Parshas Achremos, Kare'ata b'ficha. Read it. Maybe you forgot it, or maybe you never learned it. Erev Yom Kippurim, on Erev Yom Kippur. So Shachris, in the morning, Ma'amidin Osa B'Shar Mizrach, they position the coin by the eastern gate. U'ma'avirin l'fan of Parim ve'elim ukvasim. And they go ahead and literally they bring before him Parim, oxen, elim, rams, kvasim, sheep, kadesh makir baragil ba'avoda. Then I will say, remember, the whole idea over here is that Yom Kippur, remember, the avoda has to be done by the Kohen Gadol. And not only that, but it's got to move. There's a lot to do and not a lot of time. So to whatever degree they could familiarize the Kohen Gadol with the avoda, they try to do so. So the first part is we teach him the steps as they are laid out in the Chumash. Step number 2, we familiarize him with the different animals and the different types of karbanos. Kol shivas hayamim, all 7 days of his sequestering. Lo hayamonin mimenu ma'achal u'mishteh. All 7 days, whatever the Kohen Gadol wanted to eat, he would eat. Erev Yom Kippurim Mechashecha. However, Erev Yom Kippur, as it was becoming dark, meaning Yom Kippur night, already Erev Yom Kippur, before nightfall, lo hayu manichin oso lechol harbe. So we'll say, so again, obviously not Yom Kippur night, meaning Erev Yom Kippur, by the Suda Mafsekes, already by the evening, they would only allow him to eat very little, mipnei shamaycha maybe es hashena, because eating brings to sleeping. So we'll say, remember again, the primary concern over here is that we don't want the Kohen Gadol to experience a seminal emission on the night of Yom Kippur. Because if he experiences seminal emission, then what? As much as that's Tuma Kala, remember again, what's the remedy for a seminal emission? Right? Mikvah and Herav Shemesh. So remember again, you're out. In other words, once that occurs on the night of Yom Kippur, the first time he becomes potentially right to do avoda will be Matzah Yom Kippur. So obviously that doesn't help. So the goal, therefore, is we keep him up. We keep him up all night. And again, part of the way we keep him up is we don't allow him to eat a lot. Because when you eat a lot, you go ahead and say, this is often right? This is often an interesting dynamic of Kol Nidre. Right? So Kol Nidre, one of the holiest times of the year, and yet people come into shul, especially when it comes time for the drasha, and what happens? No one here knows, but I'm saying maybe you have a friend. Mamish, it's the most serene time of the year. Everybody looks so peaceful, right? They're bobbing and they're laying and this and that, because you just had a big meal, right? So again, this is not a new dynamic. So they would feed the Kohen Gadol very little in order that he would remain awake the entire night. Good. I will say that's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara. Bishlama Shamashacha. So we'll say the Gemara is intrigued by this idea that the Zikanim would go ahead and teach the Kohen Gadol the section from Achremos. Right? That's what they would do, which was the avoda of Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, why would they teach him the avoda of Achremos? They say to him, Kohen Gadol, maybe you forgot, or maybe you never learned. So it says the Gemara, Bishlam Hashem Shachach L'chai. Okay, I understand the Kohen Gadol could forget. In other words, maybe this is his first year as Kohen Gadol. He's never done this before. So of course he learned Parshas Achremos, but he forgot what the avoda is. He needs a refresher course. Ela Shema Lo Lamad. But is it possible that we're dealing with a Kohen Gadol who never learned the avoda of Yom Kippur? We'll say everybody knows the avoda of Yom Kippur. We just did Shtay Mikra V'Echad Targum last week or 2 weeks ago, right? Of course, you know the avoda for Yom Kippur. It's psukim in Chumash. Milo mukminon ki. The Gemara says, "Mi mukmino ki agavna." Would you ever have a Kohen Gadol like this who doesn't know Chumash? I was going to say the Gemara is outraged by this idea that somebody could forget and needs a refresher course. That, of course. But to say to the Kohen Gadol, maybe you never learned this before. Maybe you never learned this before. It means maybe you never learned Parshas Achremos. Is that possible for the Kohen Gadol? After all, the Gemara says, Vatanya, we learned, V'Kohen Hagadol Me'echav. So we'll say the pasuk says, when referring to the Kohen Gadol, it calls him the Kohen who is great. Now, interestingly enough, there are two ways you can read this pasuk. The Kohen Gadol Me'echav means the Kohen who is greater than his brothers. So the Gemara Darshans, what does that teach us? Shegadol Me'echav, he must be greater than his Kohanic brethren. B'koach, physical strength. B'noi, physical beauty. B'chachma, wisdom. Ba'osher, with wealth. So right, that's what it means. He must be, quote unquote, greater than his brothers in all of these areas. Achirim Omer, others say, Minaim Shim Ein Lo, She'echav HaKohanim Megatlin. So, both say, what happens if the Kohen possesses Alamailis, except he's not the wealthiest? So how do you know? This is incredible. How do we know that if he's not the wealthiest, but he's the guy, he's the one who's fit for the position, that the other Kohanim give him money in order to make him the wealthiest? Isn't that incredible? So you find the individual who possesses the right character traits for the job, but he doesn't have the wealth. So what do we do? So we'll say, wealth is the one thing, right? You can't really make someone smart, and you can't really go ahead and make someone handsome, but you can make someone wealthy. So how do we know that if he possesses all the other milas, but he doesn't have wealth, that we make him wealthy? So this is incredible. The Gemara says, the pasuk says, the Kohen, now this is a different reading. How is the Gemara reading it now? Kohen Hagadol Me'echav means the Kohen who is greater because of his brother. So we'll say two different ways to read it. Kohen who is greater than his brothers, which teaches us the Kohen has to be greater in all of these areas, and the Kohen who is greater because of his brothers, which teaches us that if he doesn't possess the wealth, that they should give him the wealth in order to make him greater. Pretty incredible. The Gemara says, Gadleyu Mishal Echad. So why is the Gemara quoting this? Because one of the prerequisites of being the Kohen Gadol is that he has to be Gadol b'chachma. Gadol b'chachma. He has to be wiser than the rest of the Kohanim. So how could it be that halacha l'maisa, they're saying to him what? They're saying to him, maybe you never learned Chumash, right? Maybe you never learned Parshas Achrei Mos. Maybe you never learned the Avoda. So ultimately, again, we're going to teach it to you. So I'll say, just before we go on, I'll tell you something interesting about this. This last drush over here, Kohen Gadol Me'echad. So interestingly enough, the Gemara goes ahead and uses it dafka in the form of wealth. In other words, if the Kohen Gadol doesn't have wealth, Kohen Hagadol Me'echav, make him wealthy from his brethren. So we'll say you could apply it to wisdom also. We'll say that sometimes, again, if somebody is intellectually impoverished, if somebody is knowledge impoverished, that Kohen Hagadol Me'echav, that sometimes, again, you have the ability to not just share your wealth and not just share your material resources with someone, but ultimately, again, to be able to share of your knowledge as well. So the Gemara says over here, what's going on? So how could it be that the Kohen Gadol doesn't know Chumash? It says the Gemara, not a problem. It's a problem, but not a question. Amar Rav Yosef lo kashya, kan b'mikdash rishon, kan b'mikdash sheni. Wow. We'll say it's referring to two different times historically. One is referring ultimately again to Mikdash Rishon. One is Mikdash Sheni. In this first temple era, second temple era. Rashi says, "B'Mikdash Rishon lo ha'emidu ela al pi Torah kohanim mihuganim." In the first temple era, only righteous kohanim gedolim were appointed. In the second temple era, so we already saw this before, right? The Gemara contrasted the ridiculous number of kohanim gedolim in the second temple era versus the first temple era, because as we'll see in the second temple era, often the position was bought. Because it was bought. So yes, you had many times, unfortunately, where there were ignorant individuals occupying the office of the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, again, the Ziknei Beis Din literally had to say, maybe you never learned this before. Maybe you just never saw this before, so we'll go over with you the pasuk in Chumash. The Gemara tells the story. Amar Rab Asi, Tarkava de Dinari, Aila le Marta bas Baitos le Yanai Malka. So we'll also listen to this story. Marta bas Baitos. Now Rashi says over here she was an Almona Ashira. She was a very wealthy widow. The Kidsha Yoshua ben Gamla. She became betrothed. She was going to marry to Yoshua ben Gamla. So this Kala, what did this woman want to do? She wanted to give a nice wedding present to her husband. So what did she buy? What did she buy for him? What did she buy for him? She bought for him the Kahuna Gedola. Right? That's what she bought for him. It's the gift that keeps on giving, right? Right? She bought from the Kahuna Gedola. Now, again, Yoshua ben Gamla was a kind of boss. I just want to point out, we're going to learn about Yoshua ben Gamla. Yoshua ben Gamla was actually a righteous man. This is the incredible part. He actually was a righteous man and a good Kohen Gadol. But amazingly enough, the position was bought for him by his Kala from Yanai Malka. Also, we're going to see also Yanai, remember this, we'll get into all of this. Yanai was one of the Hashmonai kings. So remember again, I mentioned this many times before, in the aftermath of the Chanukah story, so the Hashmonaim who were Kohanim also seized the monarchy. They seized the monarchy. So in general, remember, there's a split in Judaism between Yehuda and Levi, right? Yehuda is the monarchy, Levi is Kahuna, Chashmonaim, Levi, Kohanim took everything. Good thing, bad thing is a machlokes, but in any event, there's no question that unfortunately the Hasmonean kings kind of descended into a little bit of corruption. So Marta Bas Baitos, who was this wealthy widow, was engaged to Yoshua ben Gamla and goes ahead and buys for him the Kahuna Gedola as a present and gives it to him. And she bought it again for a lot of money. Tarkava de dinari. So Rashi says over here, Chatzi sa'at shreikav. A lot of gold. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara is just giving this as an example as what was happening during the second temple era. The Kuna Gedola was bought, and therefore, yes, unfortunately, you had many times where there were ignorant individuals who occupied the office, and therefore the Zekanim sometimes would have to say, maybe you never learned this halacha. And therefore, they have to teach him on pasuk in Chumash. Says the Gemara, every Yom Kippur Shachar. Supposed to remember again, in the morning of every Yom Kippur, what would they do? The Mishnah said they would put the coin by the eastern gate, and they would pass before him all the different types of animals. Right. So remember again, the Mishnah said parim, elim, kivasim. Right. So oxen, rams or goats, and sheep. Says the Gemara, Tana af ha-seirim. So the Gemara says, really the seirim are the goats. So the Gemara says, they would also pass by him seirim, goats. Goats. They're both said, we know this, there are 3 seirim offered up over the course of Yom Kippur. Of course, the 2 most famous seirim that we know are what? The seir la Hashem, the seir la Azazel, right? That's when the Kohen draws lots. One is offered up as a carbon, one is pushed off the cliff. So the Gemara says, "V'tana didan, my time alone tana seirim." So this is incredible. Why doesn't the Mishnah mention seirim? It's strange, no? Remember, the Mishnah mentions parim elim kvasim. Why not mention seirim? Or why? It's strange that you would leave that out. So this is incredible. Kevan da'achit kasu chal shadaite. Because also remember again, the seirim were sin offerings. Since the seirim were sin offerings, so the ziknei beis din were nervous that if the Kohanim would see, if the Kohen Gadol would see the animal which represents sin offerings on Erev Yom Kippur, there would be a chalishas hadas. He would be sad. He would be sad. They both say it's more than sad. What we're worried about over here is kind of like instilling fear. Right? The Kohen Gadol is supposed to be the representative of Klal Yisrael ultimately again on this holiest of days. And the Kohen Gadol also knows that his success is not just dependent on his own personal worth or merit, but also dependent on the worth or merit of Klal Yisrael. So if we go ahead and we bring the Seirim on Erev Yom Kippur and pass them before him, which reminds him of the guilt or the sins of Klal Yisrael, there might be a chalishos hadas. It might weaken his optimism. It might weaken his resolve. It might go ahead and engender a sense of sadness. Therefore, we leave out the seirim. To which we answer, 1 second. Ihacha par nami achet tudasi. We'll say the par is also a sin offering. So if you're worried about the fact that he's going to see sin offerings and there's going to be a chalishas hadas, a weakening of resolve, so maybe you shouldn't bring the par in front of him as well. To which the Gemara says, no. Listen, Rosa, this is incredible. Par, kevan da'alav al echav kohanim hu da'asi. We'll say the par, remember, was a sin offering. Brought for who? For the Kohen Gadol and for his fellow Kohanim. That was a unique sin offering for the Kohanim. So listen to this. The Gemara says, "Kevan da'alav al echav kohanim hu da'asi be'echav hakohanim i'ika inish te'is be'milsa meida yadalei u'mahadrele b'tshuva." Rabbi say, this is incredible. Apparently the Kohanim were a close-knit community. So the Gemara says like this. If there was a Kohen who committed an Aveira, the Kohen Gadol would know about it. Can you imagine this? If there was a Kohen who committed an Aveira, the Kohen Gadol would know about it. And what? Because he would know about it, he would make sure that Kohen did tshuva before Yom Kippur. So therefore, isn't that absolutely incredible? So the Gemara says, "B'kuli Yisrael lo yada," but obviously that was only the tight-knit community of Kohanim. Or the Kohen Gadol, if one of his brethren committed an Aveira, everybody would know, and or the Kohen Gadol would know, and he would encourage that Kohen to do tshuva. Of course, you can't say that about Klal Yisrael, and therefore again, so the par, which represents the sins of the Kohanim, that didn't create a weakening of resolve, a chalishas hadas on the part of the Kohen. Because again, if he would know about a Kohen who committed an Aveira, he would pull the guy to the side, put his arm around him like an Aaron, a Kohen, give him a talk, build him up, and help inspire him to do tshuva. But he can't do the same for all of Klal Yisrael. So the Gemara says, Ravina says, Hainu darmi inshi, this is the meaning of the expression, I bar achsech dailo, if your brother, or literally the son of your sister, I should say, if the son of your sister, in other words, your family member, is a dailo, Rashi says over here, shota hamelech, a police officer, right? If your mishpacha is a police officer, so the Gemara says, chazi b'shuka kamei lo sachlif. If you see him walking in the marketplace, run the other way. Which will say means what? In other words, if your brother, right, if your cousin or who your family member is a police officer, that means they probably know what's going on in your life, right? And if they know what's going on in your life and you've done something wrong and they have a power over you, if you see them in the shuk, better to go the other direction. So we'll say, I happen to think this Gemara is such a profound yesod, right? That the Kohanim were such a tight-knit community that if the Kohen Gadol knew that there was another Kohen who had done something wrong, he would talk to him about it. He would talk to him and encourage him to do tshuva, which I will say tells you about the power of being part of some type of close-knit chevra, some type of chabura, where ultimately, again, if you do something wrong or you're struggling with something, you have friends who could be mezares you. Right? You have people who could help you along that path, right? No person could really be successful in life all by themselves, and no person is without struggle. That's why you have to surround yourself with the right kind of people who, when you struggle, which we all do, they will give you the chizik to get back on track. You know, the Piagetna speaks about this. When he speaks about a chabura of Bnei Aliyah, a Bnei Aliyah chabura. A Bnei Aliyah chabura essentially is like a spiritual support group, right? Instead, it's a small group. He encouraged his Talmidim to form this. Small groups of people where they're honest with each other about what they're struggling, not confession, not going and saying, oh, I did this, but like speaking about the real struggles in life, because we have real struggles, and most of us don't really have people that we want to really be open and honest about our struggles. So the Piagetna encouraged his Talmidim to form these chaburas b'nei aliyah, where people would be open about their struggles. And again, first of all, when you hear other people going through the same struggles that you are, different struggles that you are, and you give each other chizik, that's ultimately, again, how people get. So that isn't incredible. So I'm jealous of the Kohanim. The Kohanim had this. This was the community of Kohanim. They were a chaburas b'nei aliyah. And that when someone did something wrong, ultimately, again, there was chizik from within the group to be able to get back on track. Absolutely incredible. Remember, again, the Mishnah said, all 7 days of sequestering, whatever the Kohen Gadol wanted to eat, he could eat. Right? The only time there were restrictions on his diet was really through the mafsekes, right? Before the start of Yom Kippur, then they would diminish, they would change his diet in order that he would, or they would just not give him a lot to eat, in order that he wouldn't become sleepy. So the Gemara says, Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa Omer. Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa says as follows: Ma'achilin oso salasos ubeitzin. Both say this is incredible. On Erev Yom Kippur, they would dafka feed him. We'll say salasos is fine flour and beitzim and eggs. Why? Kadei lemasmaso. Now both say kadei lemasmaso literally means to go ahead and loosen him. Rashi says over here, first wide line, Ma'achilin oso. Erev Yom Kippurim shakris slasos ubeitzim kedei lemasmes achila shebemeyav l'shal shalo shlo yitzarech lenakav lemachras. Both said this is incredible. So the Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekusa says that on Erev Yom Kippur they would dafka give him fine flour and eggs, which apparently loosens the bowels. They wanted him to have a full body cleanse. Right? Why? Because on Yom Kippur itself, they did not want him having to use the bathroom. Because you also remember again, Yom Kippur, we'll get into this, but it's a well-oiled machine, and the Kohen Gadol has to do everything. And the truth is, we don't want bathroom breaks on Yom Kippur. So they would dafka feed him food to have a full body cleanse, and this way, again, he would not have to use the bathroom over the course of Yom Kippur. Amrulo, kol shekin shata maybe uledechimom. Here's the problem, says the Gemara. Here's the problem. These foods, fine flour and eggs, Rashi says over here, lidechimum shall carry shasalosos ubeitzim marbemes hazera. So apparently, again, the Gemara says fine flour and eggs actually cause a person to have a seminal emission. So the Gemara, obviously not directly, but the Gemara is saying these are foods which apparently, dechimum means it increases body temperature, and apparently, again, increasing body temperature was related to a seminal emission. So the Gemara says you don't want to give the Kohanim this food, meaning it might work out the full body cleanse, but it's going to potentially lead to another repercussion which could totally invalidate the Kohen Gadol for the Avodah of Yom Kippur. Tanya, so let's analyze this. Sumchos Omer Rishon Rav Meir Ein Ma'achilin Oso Lo Abi. So we're going to see this is a mnemonic. We don't feed him Abi. That stands for three foods, which we'll see in just a moment. Va'amri Le Lo Avavi. Others say we don't feed him Avavi. Veish Omrim Af Lo Yayin Lavan. Others say we don't even give him white wine to drink. So we'll say what's Avi? Avavi. Lo Avi. Lo esrog, v'lo beitzim, v'lo yayin yashan. We don't allow him to eat esrog, we don't allow him to eat eggs, and we don't allow him to drink aged wine. So we'll say again, the idea over here is these are foods which increase body temperature. The Gemara calls it chimum, right? Internal heat, which ultimately could lead to a seminal emission. The amri lo avavi. What does avavi stand for? Lo esrog, v'lo beitzim, v'lo basar shamis. We'll say avavi adds same things, esrog beitzim, but adds in there basar shamin, fatty meat, below yayin yashan, and not aged wine. The ish omrim af lo yayin lavan. Others say also not white wine. Because white wine, interesting by the way, it's also fascinating to point out that at least in Talmudic times, white wine was never aged. Right? Only red wine was aged, white wine wasn't aged. But the Gemara says also, white wine also could lead a person to a seminal emission, therefore we avoid white wine as well. So the Gemara says, Tan Rabbanon Zav. So we'll say, so just while we're talking about foods, which could potentially lead to an emission, the Gemara just goes on a quick detour over here, it's a short detour, to Zav. So remember again, Zav is a man who has an emission. It's not a seminal emission, it's some other type of emission. But listen to this, Zav. So let's remember again, quick halachas of Zav. Remember, a Zav, a man has one emission. What's the halacha? So again, he just has to observe 1 day of Tara. Two emissions, Shiva Nekiyim. Ultimately, again, 7 clean days. 3 emissions, 7 clean days plus a carbon. That's the basic halachas of Zav. So it says the Gemara. Now, both sides. Now, all of that, well, let's see. So Zav, okay, one more. So we'll say one more thing. So Zav, if, however, you could be tola the re'iyah on something else. In other words, let's say we know that something external caused the emission, that doesn't count as Zav. That doesn't count as Zav. So the Gemara says as follows. So Zav, tolim lo b'machol v'chol mine machol. So we'll say the Gemara says, when it comes to a Zav, look at Rashi for just a moment. Zav, tolim lo b'machol im ochel ma'achal harbe mikomin. If a Zav eats a lot of whatever the food item is, so the Gemara says, shu tolim lomar shemachmas rov ma'achol ra ve'ino Zav lutumas shiva l'karban. So we'll say, if a person overate and then had an emission, a Zav emission, we attribute that emission to the overeating, and we don't count that as a real Zav emission. Neither for counting towards Shiva Nekiyim, nor ultimately, again, for carbonic purposes. Dichsiv bisaro v'lo machmas onso. Because we'll say the pasuk ultimately, again, by Zav, says Zov bisaro, that it emanates from his flesh, and not from some type of external stimulus. Aval bal keri tami ba'ones the in keri v'zov bami makom echad ve'mareim shavafad. So the Gemara will say, so when it comes to Zav, it's very interesting. When it comes to Zav, the only time that a man becomes tami alts Zav is when we feel that the emission was, we'll call it, generated internally. But if halacha l'maisa, we attribute the zivos to some type of external siba, some type of external reason, or a stimulus, we'll call it, then at the end of the day, that does not create a Zav situation. So the Gemara gives examples of this. So Tana Banan Zav, Ton lo b'machol, v'chom machol. So if a Zav overate and then had an emission, we attribute that emission to the act of overeating. And whatever food, it doesn't matter what kind of food, apparently the act of overindulgence ultimately, again, could lead to this type of emission. Elazar ben Pin Kosar Mishra Yehuda ben Beseira, Ein ma'achilin oso, we don't give a Zav to eat. Lo chagvi velo gabam velo dvarim hamavin lidei tuma. So we'll say, furthermore again, once a person has had an emission, we try to prevent them from eating certain foods which could go ahead and create another emission. So what are those foods? Chagbi and gavam. What are these? Lo chagbi, what's chagbi? Lo chalav velo gvina velo beitza. Not milk, not cheese, not eggs, velo yayin, and not wine. Velo gabam, furthermore, not gabam either. May grease and shalpul. So we'll say this is pounding when you pound lentils, the juice that comes out of the lentils. Ubasar shamin, or fatty meat, or murias. Right? We'll say murias is like fish fats or fish innards. Velo kol dvarim hamavin lidei tuma. And we also have the Zav avoid any other foods which could lead to an emission. La suye mai. What does that come to include? La suye hadatan rabbanon. It comes to include the following. Chamisha dvarim mevin asa adam lidei tuma. There are 5 things, 5 types of food or 5 items that can bring a person to an emission. Ve'eluhain. What are these items? Hashum. We'll say shum is garlic. Amud beis. Hashchalaim. Shchalaim is cress. Chalag lugos is purslane, beitzim, eggs, gargir. Let's say gargir, we actually saw this back in Brachas. Gargir is the rocket plant. It's called the rocket plant. So the Gemara said, V'yetze echar al-asad lakit oros. So we'll say the Gemara quotes a pasuk from Melachim Beis. And someone went out to the field to gather oros. Oros. I both say oros literally means what? It means light. So Tana Mishri Rabbi Meir, Zeg Gargir. What is Oros? Oros refers to the rocket plant Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Lama Nikra Shma Oros. By the way, why is the racket plant called Oros? Shemeiros es ha'inayim. Ultimately, again, apparently it's very helpful for eyesight. Amar Rav Huna, Hamotzi Gargir. Therefore, if one finds a Gargir plant, Im Yochalo Ochlo, Ochlo. If you could eat it, because it's good for eyesight. Ve'im Lav, and if not, Ma'abiro Agabe Einov. You can go ahead and what? You could put the racket plant over your eyes. Right? They both say yes. So again, apparently the act of going ahead and just actually passing the plant over your eyes itself is in and of itself incredibly helpful for one's eyesight. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows, Amar Papa, but this is not any kind of racket plant, it's dafka what? Amar Papa, Bigargira Mitzarana. So this is dafka racket plant that grows, we'll say mitzar is a border. It's dafka racket plant that grows on the border of a field. Now, what's the chap with that? So let's look at Rashi. Mitzarna, it's the first line of Rashi on top. Hagadol al ha-mitzar she'in sivivosav she'in sivivosav zera achashachish koko. So we'll say generally on the border of a field, you're not really planting plants. You don't plant vegetation on the borders, right? You plant vegetation kind of in the middle of the field. So the idea of Yerabos says as follows, that if you plant the racket plant on the borders, there are no other plants. In general, when you plant crops or plants in close proximity to each other, so what happens? They compete for soil nourishment. But if you're going ahead and planting it at the border, there are no other plants competing for soil nourishment, and therefore, again, this is a strong racket plant. So again, the racket plant is good for eyesight. The gargir is good for eyesight. If you can eat it, great. If you can't eat it, it's okay. If you can even pass it over your eyes, it's good. And dafka, look for edge of the field racket plant. Incredible. Says the Yoma. Amrav Gidl Amrav. So we'll say so just understand the flow of this. The flow of this conversation is, remember again, we begin by talking about foods that we don't want the Kohen Gadol to eat on Erev Yom Kippur, right? That's how the conversation starts. We don't want the Kohen Gadol eating certain things on Erev Yom Kippur because, again, it's going to lead to two possibilities. Number one, to sleep, and number two, to potential Hotzah Zera, to potential seminal emission. We then segue into a discussion regarding Zav, right, regarding Zav, and the idea because Zav is only problematic if halach lamaisa, he has a seminal emission that's not related to external stimuli. But there are certain foods which we know could bring on an emission, therefore we're going to prevent the Zav from eating those foods so he doesn't get himself into more Zav issues. Now Rabbi said the Gemara is segueing into a third application of this. Amarav Gidal Amarav, Ach Sinoi lo yocha beitzim. If you are a guest at someone's house, you should not eat eggs. Why shouldn't you eat eggs? So what did we just say about eggs before? Right? Rashi says over here, Lo yocha beitzim, shemevin lidei keri, umiskana b'nei habayis. So we'll say, what's the concern? If you're a guest in someone's home, right, and a person has a seminal emission, and again, if the host, when cleaning up after you, sees that it leads to a certain diminution in the way that person looks at you. So the Gemara therefore says, we'll say this is what the Gemara is really trying to highlight over here is a certain level of tznius that a person is supposed to exhibit when being in someone else's home. So don't eat eggs so it doesn't come to a solution. V'lo yishon bitaliso shabalabayis. The Gemara says, this is interesting. The Gemara says, and when going to sleep, don't use the talis of the balabayis, right? Don't use the cloak of the balabayis as your cover. Says Rashi over here, Lo yisham v'talisa shabalbayis shumiskase babayom, that the balabayis uses by day, shelo yimtza alea keri. Once again, the concern is if you're sleeping in it and you have a seminal emission, ultimately, again, the host will see that by day. So again, we'll say these are just ideas about how a person has to maintain a certain level of personal purity when staying by someone else. So the Gemara says as follows: Rav ki miklo l'darshish. We'll say this is actually incredible Gemara. So Rav, when he would go to Darshish, which was a place, Machriz, he would announce the following: Man havya liyoma. Who wants to be my wife for the day. And we'll say now, whoa, what is going on over here? So we'll say, look at Rashi. This is actually pretty incredible. Man habi liyoma, yesh isha shetinasi li liyoma. Is there a woman here who wants to marry me for the day? Shes akev kan v'teitze la'achar mikan, but only for today. Only for today. So what's going on over here? We'll explain in just a moment. Rav Nachman kad mikla l'shchensiv. When Rav Nachman would go to the city of Shchensiv, machriz man havla liyoma. Who wants to be my wife for today? So the Gemara says, what's going on over here? Vatanya, Rebbe Lazar ben Yaakov Omer, lo yisa adam isha b'medina zu, v'yelech v'yisa isha b'medina achares. So we'll say, the Gemara gives a good piece of advice. A man should not have a woman in one country and then go and marry a wife in another country. It's a solid advice, we'll say this. You can take this to the bank. And they'll say, so again, man should not have multiple wives in multiple countries. Now we'll say, remember again, there's no issue of polygamy, right? Because remember, midaraisa, you can marry more than one wife. So why shouldn't you do this? The Gemara gives a very practical reason. So the Gemara says, Shema yizdav guzeh eitzalzeh v'nimtza'ach no seachoso. Because we'll say, what's the problem? The problem is if you have multiple wives in multiple countries, Bipashtos, no one knows each other, and what's going to happen? Maybe the children from one union will end up marrying the children from a different union, and they won't even know each other. We'll say this is what's called Shema Yisa Acha Choso. Literally translated, maybe a brother and sister are going to marry each other. So again, it's just a practical piece of advice. Not an Isser. There's no Isser over here, but just a practical piece of advice to avoid people are not permitted to marry each other. Remember, we'll say, I want to point out something amazing. You see every once in a while these articles that come out regarding these people who do these ancestry tests, and it's incredible, because even today with modern technology and modern communication, people often don't know what happened in their mishpachas a generation or two generations ago. So the Gemara says, "Alachas kama v'kama." Bizmana Gemara, where communication is obviously not what it is today. So a man has multiple wives in multiple countries. It's a recipe for disaster. Well, it's a recipe for disaster on a variety of levels. But the Gemara says over here, the concern is one of incest, incest is forbidden marriage between relatives. So the Gemara says, "Umamali kala olam mamzerus," and a person could end up filling the world with mamzerim. No one wants to be responsible for that. V'al zeh ne'emar umala haaretz zima. And about this, the pasuk says, the world will be filled with immorality. So we'll say, so therefore, again, the Gemara says, so we'll say, let's take a step back over here. Let's take a step back. What is happening over here when Rav Nachman would come to Shchensiv, would Rav come to Darshish? What's going on over here when they say, who wants to be my wife for the day? So we'll say we're gonna go ahead and kind of fill out the framework over here a little bit. But remember, just contextually, right? What's the topic of the Gemara? The topic of the Gemara is about the need to preserve a level of, we'll call it spiritual purity and modesty when being away from home. So what we're going to see over here, Abba says, what's happening is that when these Rabbanim, Rav, and who was it? Rav Nachman, who wants to be my wife for the day, what they were concerned about was falling prey to immorality when they were away from home. That was the concern over here. Being subject to immorality. So what they're looking, now it's not clear exactly what they're looking to accomplish, because remember, they're obviously not in the market for a long-term relationship, because at the end of the day, they're asking, wants to marry me for a day. So what exactly is it that they were looking for? Were they actually looking for a physical relationship, or were they looking for something else? We'll see in just a moment. But I will say, but again, I just want to point out how incredible this is, that Rav and Rav Nachman, who were great people, understood that the lure of immorality, especially when you are away from home, especially when you're traveling by yourself, is so incredibly profound that a person has to take proactive steps in order to save themselves from getting themselves into trouble. So we'll say, it's not quite clear what they're trying to accomplish here, so let's fill out the framework. So the Gemara says, 1 second. The Gemara says, so we'll say, so first of all, number one, how do you run into the problem of Rav and Rav Nachman having multiple wives in multiple places and ultimately potentially filling the world with mamzerim, right? Unintentionally. How do you deal with that? To which the Gemara says this is not a difference. Amri Rabbanan Kala Islu. So both say the only concern about a man having a wife in this country and a wife in that country and having children with both of them, and the children ultimately marrying each other, is when the guy's a regular guy. But Rav and Rav Nachman were Rabbanim. Rabbanim have a reputation, and so again the children would know to identify as the children of Rav Nachman or the children of Rav. So even if they did father children in multiple countries, there's no concern that those children would go ahead and end up marrying each other because they know definitively who their father is. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says, "V'Rabbanan kala islu ushmam kari abanehem," and therefore their name is attached to their children. So there's no. The concern of Shema Yisa Ach Achoso is when sometimes the paternity itself is not as known. But when the paternity is known, especially when your father is famous, there's no concern that siblings may come to marry each other. So Gemara says there's another problem. Both say there's a fascinating halacha, which is codified in Shulchan Aruch, called Dam Chimud. Dam Chimud means that if a man asks a woman to marry him, and she says yes, there's a concern that out of her excitement and out of her desire, she may bleed. So it's called in halacha dam chimud. We saw it, it's sugya, in Meseches Nida. That's what Rabbi say. If a man says to a woman, let's get married, and she says yes, they can't go to the chuppah that day. There's a minimum waiting period of 7 days. 7 days. So I don't understand. So Rav Nachman, you're rolling into town, you say, who wants to be my wife for the day? Right? And the Rachel says, yes, I'll do it. That's fine. Even if she says yes today, you still have to wait 7 days, right? You can't get married for 7 days. The Gemara says, "Taboli naseh b'nispaisa, b'nispaisa shivnikim." We'll say this is the halach of dam chimud. To which the Gemara says, "Rabbanon odui havu modaluhu mikodem havu mekabni u'mishaji shlucha." No. Rav and Rav Nachman, when they were traveling to these particular cities, they knew they were coming. They would send a shaliach 7 days ahead, right? And they would go ahead and put out Rav and Rav Nachman are looking for a wife for 1 day, right? So who wants to, right? Who would like to be the wife of Rav and Rav Nachman for 1 day? And again, they would do this 7 days ahead, so that by the time ultimately Rav Nachman would come to town, they would be permitted to be married. So the Gemara says, well, we still have other problems. Well, so to which the Gemara says, maybe we're really misunderstanding this entire thing. And maybe what's actually happening is as follows. That halacha l'maisa, there wasn't really a marriage that was actually happening over here. Rather, what was happening, so to speak, someone was being designated. That if Rav or Rav Nachman wanted to marry, actually, let me say it differently. Let me read the words, and then we're going to see is a profound machlokes Rashi Tosas over here. So literally it means, the Gemara says, the other possibility is, yichude hava miyachti lehu. Literally, again, a woman would be set aside, so to speak. In other words, a woman would identify, she'd step forward, and she would set aside herself. So we'll see what those words mean in just a moment. So look at Rashi, yichudi ba'alma, ve'enis kakin lahen, ela shanasoi isha in mis'aveh, kimisha ein lo isha. To which the Gemara says something amazing. They would marry them. Rav Nachman, they'd come to Shchensiv or to, what was the other place? Darshish, and they would marry these women. 1 second. But if you come into town and you marry her, I'll say, what's the halacha? There's no relations for 7 days. So how would this help? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you how it would help. Rashi says, Lefi she'ino domeh, mishi yesh lo pas b'salo, lemishi she'in lo pas b'salo. Both say you can't compare someone who has bread in his basket to someone who doesn't have bread in his basket. In other words, both say the knowledge that they had a wife when they came to these places, even though again relations would not be permitted, was enough to quiet the Yetzer Hara. Others will say what they were, according to Rashi, what they were doing was they were taking preventative steps here in order to just quiet the Yetzer Hara. So if Rav Nachman, if they say, I know I have an outlet for relations. It's true. It's not right now. It's not this second. It would have to be 7 days from now. But I know that outlet is there. The knowledge that I could satisfy that desire in a permitted way is enough to quiet the fires of the Yetzer Hara. So in fact, according to Rashi, there was a marriage, even though again it was a marriage that could not be consummated, but that was enough to go ahead and take care of the Yetzer Hara. That's Rashi. If you look at Tosas, quickly, Tosas says, Yichudi ba'alma hava miyachdilu, Perish Rashi, lo hayuban aleha, Ella misyachad iman. So remember again, as Rashi already points out, that this was a marriage that could not be consummated. We already spoke about this before because of dam chimud. Right? So even though technically speaking a marriage could take place, right, it could not be consummated. Ella misyachadin imahin. V'sulo. Rather, again, what would happen? Even though it could not be consummated, they could live together. Says the Gemara, but that's not true. The Gemara says, "V'hikshari im kein kevan da'asurin lava aleh my pas besalo ika." So I will say, so again, if the whole idea was that this was an arrangement in order to go ahead and quiet the Yetzer Hara, so how is the arrangement beneficial if at the end of the day the relationship cannot be consummated? To which the Gemara says, "My pas besalo ika miu yeshlamar kevan deshari la'achar zayin pas besalo karinave." So we'll say, so here Tosfos is just explaining Rashi a little bit more. So this was a marriage that could not be consummated. How was it pas bisalo? It was pas bisalo because, again, he knows after 7 days it can't be consummated. So the knowledge that ultimately, again, there's a permissible outlet, albeit 7 days away, is enough to quiet the Yetzer Hara. Va'od hikshu heichi shar le'echudi ba'adahu. We'll say, now Tosfos here brings up another related issue, which I will say, this means this would be a chupas nida. A chupas nida. If a man and woman get married and the woman is in nida, so again, you can get married when a woman is in nida, but there's an interesting halachic wrinkle on this, which is, there's an isser yichud. There's an isser yichud. See, I both say, normally, when a woman is in nida, there's no isser yichud between husband and wife when a woman is in nida, which I will say is interesting, because generally the isser yichud applies to anyone who is usher to you as an erva. Well, when a woman is in nida, she's an erva. So why is there no isur yichud between a husband and a wife when the wife is in nida? So again, the Gemara says, because since she's going to be permitted to him, there's no concern about ultimately, again, them coming to transgress in a yichud situation. But that only applies once a husband and wife have consummated their relationship. But before they consummate their relationship, if there's a chupas nida, and again, I will say it happens, and it's a little bit of an awkward situation for the chas and the kala in the beginning, but if the husband and wife get married, there is an isser yichud when they get married until they are able to consummate their relationship. So the Gemara says over here, I don't understand, you're making this sound like it's pas b'sal, okay, they can't have relations, but they're married, and the knowledge that they can have an intimate relationship, albeit 7 days from now, is enough to quiet the fires de Yitzhara. But there's an Isser Yichud if he marries her when she's in Nida. To which the Gemara says, Parakama d'ksuvas, Misha pirse ishto Nida, v'lo bal, hu yoshin bin ha'anoshim, v'ishto yishena bin ha'anoshim. L'achim perishri, d'chi amrinon man habi liyoma, lo amri man habi liyoma li baal, eli yachudi ba'alma, v'chevan shayu omrim lohen, kak rak liyachid imayim, lo hayu ra'os dam machmas chimos. We'll say it's very interesting. To which Tosfos posits that at the end of the day, there were never actual marriages that take place, but rather, again, what? There was yichud. In other words, yichud means that when they would come to town, Rav and Rav Nachman would identify, right? Would meet someone who they could potentially marry. Did they actually marry? Sounds like, according to Tosfos, the answer to that is no. But ultimately, again, the potential to be married and the potential to have a permitted outlet for this desire was enough to go ahead and quiet the Yetzer Hara in this particular regard. Which I will say tells us something, a number of incredible takeaways from this Gemara. First of all, I will say that to recognize that everyone struggles with their taivas, right? Everyone struggles with their desires. If it happened to Rav and Rav Nachman, ultimately, again, then how much more so to regular people. And I will say, furthermore, to be fully aware of one's we'll call it spiritual weaknesses, or to be fully aware of one's moral weaknesses, and ultimately, again, to take proactive steps to bolster those weaknesses. Because often if we allow ourselves to find ourselves in the way of temptation, by the time I'm already there, it's already too late. 9 out of 10 times, if I'm already in the way of temptation, I'm going to lose that battle. But if I take proactive steps to prevent myself from getting into a compromising position to begin with, then Allah I have the ability to overcome that desire, to overcome that taiva, and to be successful as well. All right, so we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with the new Mishnah tomorrow.